Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Rockies Daily. I'm your host, Scott Ayers, where we talk all things Colorado Rockies. Before we get started, you did it. If you're watching this, you did it. You made it into another year. Happy 2026. Congratulations. Hoping for a year not full of misery, but full of joy, success, and a lot of wins for the Colorado Rockies. Let's jump into it. Let's talk about a potential trade, one that was even noted by Bleacher Report, and that is Nick Castellanos coming to the Colorado Rockies. Now, this is obviously an interesting proposition because for players of this caliber who have had a lot of success that have now struggled, the Rockies aren't typically mentioned in deals like this. But this is one that actually makes sense for someone like Castellanos, who him and the Phillies are not necessarily on good terms. There are high odds that he does not play for the Phillies next season, and that's where the Rockies could come in for something like making a deal. Now, his contract is crazy, so there are a couple different things. He's owed like $30 million in the final year of his contract. So, one possibility in a trade are the Phillies actually trade Castellanos and they handle a good chunk of that contract. Let's say $20 million is what Bleacher Report was noting. And it could be anything, right? Even if it's half, $15 million, $18 million. The Rockies have, this is one of the few times where the Rockies have legitimate leverage because you could also be poised to say, hey, you know what, if you're not going to trade him and you just have to cut him, then you don't get anything in return. Obviously, then the Rockies are at risk where Castellanos might not sign with Colorado. So it could make sense, though, for a potential deal where you're not going to have to give up much. If you're Colorado, you should not give up any core piece or anything like that. But by acquiring Castellanos, something that you can do there is you can slot him at DH. You can play him at first base. And I say that because right now he is slotted as an outfielder. But he was one of the worst outfielders defensively in baseball last year. Really just would not be someone that you slot into the outfield unless you just need a start in right field every 10 days or so, right? So you bring him in with the hope that he can play first base. Him and Troy Johnson might platoon at first base, as well as being a DH. So there's the win for the Rockies side of things because you're getting a veteran presence at probably a very, very cheap price, especially if they're going to cover some of that contract. That's where it really makes sense for Colorado. And for Castellanos, something like this makes sense because, hey, I had a bad season in 25. I struggled in 2024. Second half of 24 wasn't bad, but overall, last couple seasons haven't been great. Well, now I have a chance to really revitalize my career, right? I have a chance to hopefully perform well with low expectations, right? You come to Colorado, you're no longer playing to compete for a World Series. At this point, you're just playing to prove that you still have something left. Because then it becomes an opportunity for the Rockies to kind of have a double win, for lack of better terms, a chance to actually reap something here where you could trade him for a cheap value, and if he plays well, now you have an opportunity to actually flip him at the trade deadline to a contending team. So the Rockies, for a trade like this, it makes a lot of sense because not only can you get a guy who still has some pop in his bat that could play first base or play DH, he just gives you some more stability, and you can get it at a really cheap price. And then in turn, if he plays well, great, now we can actually flip him. Or, maybe you sign him to a cheap contract for a couple years after. I don't necessarily see that. I could see it as just a one and done type of deal. But if he plays well, that's great because the hope is you can flip him to another team. Alternatively, if he doesn't play well, it's really no harm, no foul because you're not going to be competing for the division this year. You're not going to be probably competing for a wild card spot this year. So if it doesn't work, hey, at least we tried. We didn't give up much. And for the Phillies, they just want to get off that contract. even if it means eating some of it in a trade. So to be able to acquire someone like Nick Castellanos, who, again, he isn't obviously the same player as he once was, but he would still provide something, and he would still give the Rockies much-needed depth and a much-needed, just somewhat stable bat in the lineup. So I think that would be something exciting that we could see moving into the new year because, let's face it, we're in 2026. We can put the past behind us, and we will reflect to end the show. But let's talk about building on 2026. Obviously, making a trade for someone like Castellanos would be great. I think another building block, though, would be to figure out who this core is. Paul De Podesta has talked about it. They've talked about figuring out what they actually have. That is a huge key in 2026. Who are the guys you're going to build around? And if it's not going to be players that we've seen in trade rumors like Britton Doyle, how do you move on from those players in terms of a trade? How do you acquire assets that make the most sense? So developing and figuring out the core is a crucial key in making all this work. Because in 25, there were just so many players slumping and struggling that you didn't really get a good view. You need players to actually start to develop in 2026. So I would say that's one big thing. Secondly, is we talked about flipping an asset like Castellanos if he came to the Rockies and played well. But can the Rockies flip different assets? Can they flip guys that can help the future of this team? You think of a reliever like Victor Vodnik, who the Rockies are pretty high on. Could he be someone that you deal at the deadline? Mickey Moniak, who we talked about last show. Could he be someone that you deal near the deadline because he's playing well? And then, of course, there's someone like Britton Doyle, who has been mentioned in a lot of trade rumors over the last year, both deadline and in free agency. Is he someone where the Rockies say, hey, you know what? This isn't a key core piece. We're going to move on from him. So that's another big thing in 2026 is acquiring assets to build for the future because the Rockies don't have enough assets right now. They just don't have enough things to play with at this figurative poker table, right? I just think of, hey, everyone's got their chips. You know, you're going all in. You're dividending things up, and the Rockies don't have many poker chips. They just don't. They have a couple. And, you know, those chips are guys like Tovar, Hunter Goodman. I think Dollander is going to be one of those chips as well. But that's going to be a key in 2026. I think one huge building block is, can you just avoid being the worst team in baseball? Like, what a pathetic and silly thing to ask. But seriously, like, how as a team and an organization can you improve from last year and try to ensure that you're not just the worst team in baseball for another season? How do you improve from a 43-win season? That's a legitimate question that the Rockies will need to have answers to. Because I think for fans, if you see another season where the team wins 45, 46, 50 games, that's not good enough. And it shouldn't be, right? Like, the in-state teams, you know, the Nuggets, the Avalanche, they shouldn't have more wins in their 82-game seasons than the Rockies have in a 160-game season. And it's a weird comparison, but it is important just to think about and contextualize how little it is to win only 43 games. Like, that's crazy. So build from that. The goal should be 60 wins, 65 wins. Like, that's not crazy. 60 wins, you're still losing 100 games, but that would mean we're actually seeing some form of marginal improvements across the board. And then I think we've talked about improving the infield, but also that rotation. How do you solidify the rotation so you can have 3 or 4 guys that you can trust? Because right now, you have 3 guys that you know are going to start, but can you trust them? And that's going to be the real thing. Can you actually build and model off of what we saw, you know, in that playoff run against where they beat the Cubs and they got swept by the Brewers, where you had Marquez, Senzatella, Kyle Freeland, and you were building something. How can the Rockies kind of get back to that place where you're building something and you have guys that can be that core of the rotation? It just goes back to those building blocks and figuring out what the Rockies actually have. So for Colorado, maybe you don't make any free agent signings that are big splashes, but be interesting to see what the trades will be made moving into the season and before the trade deadline, which is obviously months and months away. But those are some of the key building blocks as we move into 2026. And as for expectations, 60 wins should be an expectation, as well as try not to be the worst team in baseball. You're probably going to finish last in the division. But anything fourth or better in the division, I would say, is a pretty big win. Right? So those are just a couple of the different keys that we look at moving into 2026. And one of the things that we could see in 2026 is following in the Angels' footsteps, right? And that is what they did with Anthony Rendon. And that is they made a contract restructure with Rendon. He was owed a bunch of money, and they've restructured that contract, so now they'll pay him out for the next 3 or 4 seasons, freeing up significant amount of money to be able to go after different players. And for the Rockies, they should heavily consider this with Chris Bryant. And I mention that because Chris Bryant, over the next 3 years, is owed $81 million. So, it's all owed money. The Rockies can't get out of it. They're not going to be able to trade it. There's just no way a team will want to trade for Chris Bryant, because now that Rendon is done, Chris Bryant has the worst contract in baseball, one of the worst contracts in sports. Like Deshaun Watson probably is one of the only guys who has a worse contract than Chris Bryant. And Paul DePodesta might have been somewhat responsible for the Deshaun Watson contract. Besides the point. But Chris Bryant has one of the worst contracts in all of major leagues, or in all of sports. But one of the things to consider is, can you restructure it to really free up that space for the Rockies? Because that's probably one of the big issues of being able to go after any sort of big free agent, is you're paying a guy right now who can't play. And so for that restructure, it's something where he probably has one more year with the Rockies in 26. And then you don't owe him as much money, and maybe you're able to restructure it where you pay him out for the next, 8 to 10 years, which sounds crazy, but it would free up a ton of space for the Rockies. I think that might make the most sense for Colorado. Best case scenario, that I would not get excited about this because I just don't think it would ever happen. Chris Bryant comes out 2026. He's slugging 500. He's batting 280. He's hitting bombs left and right. And a team calls Josh Burns and says, hey, look, we want KB for this playoff push. Whatever they offer, you accept. Whatever they offer, you accept. I say that because it won't happen. I think the good days of Chris Bryant are behind us. We don't even know if he'll play again just due to his injuries. So, if you have a way to restructure that contract with Chris Bryant, you've got to be able to take it. And you've got to be able to free up space so that you can start building something here, right? We just talked about the building blocks of 2026. One of those building blocks is, how can you figure out this contract so you can start bringing in new players, or you can start trading for players, or whatever. This contract can be really a key source in a lot of the pain that the Rockies are feeling. And there's not a lot of ways to get out of it. A trade's not possible at the moment. Some form of contract restructure would be massive for Colorado. It would be huge just to free up that space. Obviously, the alternatively speaking, you just eat the next 3 years and then you're just done for good. And say, it's 3 years. Ethan Holiday will be ready by then. That's good. But if the Rockies want to start building now, they'll have to figure something out. If they want to wait 3 years, then you go that route and just risk the possibility of losing more fans. we'll see. We'll see what Colorado does, but I do think it is a very intriguing thing, especially something that they'll more likely consider after the 2026 season when there's less money owed. But let's move into that last segment here. We're closing the books of a 2025. I think most of us will want to forget for a lot of different reasons. Obviously, we just talked about Chris Bryant. He was useless in 2025. The team won 43 games. Bud Black was finally let go, which honestly, for Bud Black, he's probably thankful. He's probably like, hey, 2025 is a good year. Didn't have to stay with this organization any longer. I can go into retirement with joy and not a thought in the world about this team. We also did have some positive notes, right? Hunter Goodman, huge positive note. Silver Slugger, obviously was just great in general for the Rockies. Mickey Moniak having a huge bounce back. There were some silver linings to 2025. Obviously, the team kind of rallied around Warren Schaefer, which is great. So, look, hey, there's some guys that were some things that were okay. But then you obviously look, last in ERA, last in WHIP, most home runs allowed, last in on-base percentage. They were in the bottom 10 in every hitting category. They struck out the second most in all of baseball. It was a season to forget for the Colorado Rockies. But we're closing the book. 2025 is done. 2025 who? 43 wins. I don't know what you're talking about. That's going to be my response moving forward if anyone says anything. Don't know. 2025 doesn't exist. In fact, it goes 2023, 2024, started 2026. That's got to be the way we look at it. I don't know what 2025 is. Don't even know how to count that high. But I know how to get to 2026. But until then, I hope you all have a wonderful New Year's. I hope you just soak it in. Because the 2026 Rocks are coming, whether you like it or not. The team is going to be better this year. Mark my words. They cannot be worse than 43 wins. They can't be. I won't allow it. But until next time, I hope you have a wonderful New Year's. Have a wonderful day. And I'll see you next time.